If two submerged brush piles look exactly identical from the bank, and both are holding a massive school of crappie, why does a standard slip bobber rig get hammered aggressively on one and completely ignored on the other? Most bank anglers sitting on a bucket assume the fish just are not in a feeding mood, or that the barometric pressure is entirely wrong for the day, or that they simply need to change the color of their plastic jig. The reality of the situation has absolutely nothing to do with the color of the bait, and everything to do with cranial anatomy and basic geometric positioning. Crappie have a severe physical limitation that governs every single feeding decision they make throughout their entire lifespan. Their large eyes are positioned near the very top of their skull, forcing their binocular field of vision permanently upward toward the surface. Furthermore, their lower jaw is distinctly longer than their upper jaw, creating a mouth structure that naturally hinges, opens, and extends vertically into the water column above them. This specific biological design means that a jig suspended even 2 inches below their horizontal holding depth is biologically invisible and mechanically impossible for them to efficiently attack without turning their entire body upside down. If your slip bobber is set to place the bait precisely at 6 feet deep, and the crappie are holding tightly at 5 feet deep, you're fishing completely empty water, no matter how perfect the structure looks from the shoreline. By the end of this video, there are 3 highly specific things you will understand about fishing from the bank that will permanently change how you approach the water. You will know the exact physiological reason your current depth setting is likely costing you dozens of fish without ever needing an expensive electronic depth finder to prove it. You will know the precise mathematical placement required to pull a territorial fish out of heavy cover without snagging your rig on every single cast. And you will know exactly what a bobber that lays flat on the surface instead of plunging downward is actually telling you about the feeding behavior of the fish on your next cast. Picture a very specific, highly realistic scenario on your local lake, reservoir, or community pond. You're walking the muddy bank on a Tuesday morning, and you find a moderate-sized laydown, an old oak tree that has fallen from the shoreline directly into the water after a heavy storm. The thick, decaying trunk extends out about 20 feet from the dry land, disappearing into the dark, heavily stained water where the bottom contour drops off to roughly 8 feet deep. There is a slight, consistent breeze pushing parallel to the bank, creating a small rhythmic ripple on the surface, and the morning sun is rising brightly over your right shoulder. This specific environment is the absolute perfect laboratory for bobber fishing from the bank, because the lack of electronics forces you to read the natural environment instead of passively relying on a digital screen. Most casual anglers will walk right up to this exact fallen tree, clip on a standard fixed round plastic bobber, tie a jig 3 feet below it, and start casting randomly at the visible branches breaking the surface. They might catch one aggressive, roaming fish on the extreme outside edge if they are incredibly lucky, but they will inevitably snag the heavy wood twice in a row, lose their entire rig, and walk away firmly believing the spot has been completely fished out. The failure happening in this exact moment is not the location, and it is certainly not the quality of the fishing equipment being used. The fundamental failure is treating the bobber as a simple flotation device designed purely to keep the hook off the bottom, instead of properly utilizing it as a precision depth control instrument. We are going to mentally execute 2 completely different casts at this exact fallen oak tree to see exactly where the difference happens in the water column and how the fish react to each presentation. Let us carefully analyze the first cast, which perfectly represents the absolute most common depth error made by bank anglers across the country. The angler approaches the fallen oak tree, visually guesses that the water is 6 feet deep near the thickest part of the trunk, and sets their slip bobber stop knot tightly at 5.5 feet, trying to get the jig as close to the submerged branches as humanly possible. They execute a hard cast directly into the center of the tight V shape, created by two large limbs breaking the rippled surface of the water. The bobber lands with a heavy splash. The weight of the lead split shot pulls the monofilament line rapidly through the hollow stem of the float, and the bobber stands straight up as the bait reaches its final destination. Underneath the dark surface, the jig settles deeply into the dense branches at exactly 5.5 feet deep, hovering just inches above the muddy bottom. The critical biological problem here is that the school of crappie is suspended directly above those deeper branches, using the heavy wood strictly for security, but holding horizontally in the water column at exactly 4 feet deep. Because of the physical positioning of the crappie's eyes on the top of their head, their entire cone of vision is directed exclusively toward the surface, constantly searching for dark silhouettes moving against the ambient light of the sky. The small jig, sitting a full 1.5 feet below their horizontal plane, blends completely into the dark, muddy background of the lake floor and essentially does not exist in their sensory world. The angler watches the brightly colored bobber for 3 uninterrupted minutes, sees absolutely zero movement, assumes there are no active fish in the tree, and reels in rapidly to find another spot along the bank. Now, let us closely examine the second cast, which is executed using the biologically correct depth protocol based on the anatomy of the target species. Instead of trying to reach the absolute bottom of the visible structure to find hiding fish, this angler slides the slip bobber knot up the line and sets it at exactly 3 feet deep. The cast is made to the exact same tight V shape in the submerged branches where the first angler failed. The jig descends rapidly through the water, but the float stops the line short, leaving the bait suspended a full foot above the highest holding crappie in the entire school. The presentation is now silhouetted perfectly against the bright, rippled surface of the water above, creating a hard, undeniable contrast. The crappie does not have to look down, search the mud, or contort its body. It simply tracks the high contrast profile moving directly above its head, flares its gills to create a powerful internal vacuum, and inhales the bait as it rises vertically from the safety of the cover. The bobber instantly shoots under the surface, and the fish is hooked securely in the roof of the mouth, safely above the heavy snag zone, allowing the angler to winch it directly over the wood without ever touching a branch. But dialing in the perfect depth setting is only the first variable in this equation, and the physical placement of the cast introduces the next critical error that costs bank anglers dozens of fish every single trip. Let us go back to the first angler, who desperately wants to place their jig precisely at the end of that submerged trunk where they assume the biggest, most dominant fish usually hide. They aim directly for the absolute last visible piece of wood sticking out of the water and fire a hard, aggressive cast right on top of the intended target. The 1/8 ounce jig, the heavy lead split shot, and the large plastic float crash violently into the surface directly above the holding fish, sending a massive, unignorable acoustic pressure wave straight down into the water column. Water is an extremely dense medium that transmits physical vibration infinitely faster than air, meaning the highly sensitive lateral line of the crappie picks up this sudden overhead impact as an immediate predatory threat, flawlessly mimicking the dive of an osprey or a heron. This direct, violent impact causes the entire school to instantly compress tighter into the core of the wood, locking their jaws shut and completely shutting down their natural feeding instinct out of pure self-preservation. The jig eventually drops perfectly into the strike zone, but the fish have already been severely negatively conditioned by the aggressive, unnatural splash of the arrival. The second angler completely understands how hydrodynamics work and knows exactly how to use the natural wind and the surface drift to their absolute advantage. Noticing the slight breeze moving parallel to the muddy bank, this angler aims 15 feet entirely upwind of the submerged trunk, casting into completely open, featureless, structureless water. The rig lands incredibly smoothly. The inevitable splash of the weight occurs far away from the holding fish, and the jig is allowed to settle to the chosen depth in absolute peace and silence. Then, the angler simply leaves the bail closed and allows the natural wind current to slowly and methodically push the bobber laterally toward the submerged tree. The jig approaches the heavy structure horizontally, moving at the exact, mathematically perfect speed of the natural surface current without any sudden, jerky mechanical movements from the rod. To the highly cautious crappie holding safely in the dense branches, this approach does not feel like a violent intrusion from an overhead predator. It looks exactly like a stunned, injured baitfish drifting helplessly into their natural, pre-established ambush zone. The strike happens aggressively and with absolute confidence before the bobber ever physically touches the outer branches of the wood. The third variable involves what happens when the bobber is sitting perfectly in the strike zone. The depth is correct, but the initial reactionary bite does not happen immediately upon the bait's arrival. The first angler watches their float drifting slowly near the main trunk of the oak tree and decides to passively play the waiting game. They leave the bail of the spinning reel open, lean their long rod against a forked stick stuck deeply in the mud, and allow the bobber to sit completely dead and motionless on the surface for 5 straight minutes. Below the surface, the marabou jig is hanging vertically, absolutely static, stiff, and lifeless in the quiet water column. While it is true that crappie will occasionally hit a dead-sticked bait during extreme peak feeding windows, a completely motionless artificial jig often totally fails to trigger their sensitive lateral line receptors, which are specifically biologically tuned to detect microscopic water displacement from struggling, dying prey. Without any physical movement, the soft marabou feathers compress tightly against the cold steel of the hook shank, making the bait look like a tiny, unappealing, inanimate stick. The school of fish stares intently at the bait, processes the complete lack of vibration, recognizes it as non-living material, and eventually ignores it completely to look for real food. The second angler takes a completely different, highly intentional mechanical approach to the inevitable pause in the natural wind drift. When the bobber reaches the absolute prime zone next to the thickest, darkest part of the trunk, this angler removes all the slack from the monofilament line until it is perfectly tight straight from the rod tip to the eyelet of the float. Instead of reeling the bait rapidly away from the cover and ruining the cast, they give the rod tip one single, sharp, 2-inch downward twitch and immediately return the rod to its original resting position. This precise action imparts a sudden, aggressive popping motion to the bobber on the surface, which translates directly down the tight line, causing the jig below to dart aggressively upward for exactly 1 inch before fluttering slowly back down on a slack line. As the jig falls back down, the microscopic marabou feathers flare wide open, significantly expanding the visual profile of the bait in the water and displacing a tiny amount of liquid. This sudden vertical displacement sends a distinct, low-frequency acoustic vibration through the water, flawlessly mimicking the exact, frantic struggle of a dying minnow fighting desperately to stay upright. The crappie's lateral line detects the rhythmic pulse instantly. Their predatory instinct completely overrides their initial hesitation, and they strike out of pure, aggressive reaction to the subtle, forced movement. The final comparative variable in this exact scenario is how the angler actually reads and interprets the physical information the bobber provides during the exact microsecond of the bite. The first angler is watching their brightly colored float with intense, unbroken focus, waiting desperately for the classic visual cue they were taught as a child, the bobber plunging violently and rapidly beneath the surface of the lake. They are staring at the bright orange top, waiting for it to disappear completely into the dark, stained water. Suddenly, the slip bobber simply falls over on its side, lying completely flat and motionless on the surface of the water, as if the heavy lead split shot has miraculously fallen off the line entirely.